The desert breathes like a sleeping god, vast and silent, its golden dunes swallowing all sound except the whisper of wind. Here, beneath the blinding sun, Egypt was born, not from peace, but from ritual, blood, and divine fear. To the ancients, life itself was a bargain struck with unseen powers. The pharaoh stood at the center of this fragile covenant, not merely a ruler, but a living bridge between gods and mortals, between order and chaos. His heart did not belong to him. It beat for the gods, and the gods demanded proof that he still deserved their favor. That proof came through pain. In the Egyptian worldview, pain was not an accident or a punishment, it was sacred currency. Every drop of blood spilled in ritual, every scream that echoed through the temple halls, was a reminder that the gods were listening. To suffer was to participate in divine order, the great cosmic balance known as Ma'at. Without it, the world would collapse into Isfit, the nightmare of chaos. The priests understood this balance better than anyone. If pain ceased, if offerings weakened, the Nile might dry, the stars might falter, and the dead would no longer find their way to eternity. Thus, pain was not cruelty, it was maintenance of the universe itself. The pharaoh's pain, however, was different. It was chosen, deliberate, wrapped in ceremony. Before dawn, he would stand upon cold temple stone, purified by silence, stripped of mortal comfort. Ritual fasting, isolation, and even controlled flagellation were not marks of suffering but of devotion. His agony was a message to the gods, "I am still yours." The act of enduring became a form of prayer, his body the altar upon which Egypt's destiny rested. The priests who anointed him understood this duality. He was adored by millions but owned by the divine. The golden mask that hid his face in public was not a symbol of majesty, but of imprisonment. In the inner sanctums, where few ever entered, the god's hunger was palpable. Incense burned thick as the chants began, low, rhythmic, and ancient. The priests would draw symbols of protection upon the pharaoh's skin, each mark echoing a divine wound from myth. Every cut, every sting of the ritual whip, mirrored the suffering of Osiris torn apart by his brother Seth, or Ra scorched by his own sunfire as he crossed the underworld. Through pain, the pharaoh reenacted the very stories that kept the cosmos alive. To flinch was to invite disaster. To endure was to reaffirm the divine cycle. This devotion to pain created a culture where beauty and brutality existed side by side. The same hands that carved the soft curves of a lotus on temple walls also carved the faces of slaves, branding them for divine service. The same voice that spoke gentle prayers to Hathor could command the torture of a thief as a sacrifice to Anubis. Pain was never random. It was structured, justified, sanctified. Egypt's magnificence was not in spite of this suffering. It was built upon it, as surely as its pyramids were built on crushed stone and broken backs. And yet, behind this divine logic lay a deeper, more haunting truth. Pain connected humans to their gods because it was the one thing both could feel. The pharaoh suffered to remind the gods of their own struggles, the endless battle between order and chaos that mirrored the torment of mortal life. When blood touched the temple floor, it was said that Ra himself turned his gaze toward earth, pleased by the echo of his own trials. To hurt was to be seen. To bleed was to be acknowledged by eternity. The introduction closes with a sense of reverent dread. The viewer understands that in ancient Egypt, pain was not simply endured, it was engineered, exalted, and elevated to divine necessity. The gods demanded to be satisfied, and satisfaction required suffering. The sands of Egypt glowed not just from sunlight, but from the heat of devotion, the fire of flesh offered to the heavens. And so begins the story of how the pharaohs, in their radiant splendor, became both gods and prisoners, rulers of men, yet slaves to the endless hunger of the divine. The coronation of a pharaoh was not a celebration of power, it was an ordeal of transformation. To the Egyptians, a ruler was not simply crowned, he was remade. From the moment of ascension, his flesh was no longer his own, his breath belonged to the gods, and his pain became the rhythm through which the divine world pulsed. The pharaoh was not worshipped for his comfort, but for his endurance. His body was the visible proof that heaven and earth were still in harmony, that the divine heart still beat inside mortal skin. The priests called him the Golden One, yet beneath that gold was the trembling weight of sacrifice. In the secret halls of the temple, before the people ever saw his radiant crown, the pharaoh was stripped bare. His human identity was peeled away through ritual fasting, days without sleep, and purification in icy waters drawn from the Nile before dawn. This was not cruelty, it was tuning. To stand before the gods, the body had to be emptied of weakness, the mind severed from earthly fear. The priests would coat him in sacred oils, whispering hymns that promised renewal through torment. These early rites were designed to break him, not destroy him, to rebuild him as something other than human. The process of pain was a process of alignment, where agony became a form of clarity. The belief that pain cleansed the soul came from the myth of Osiris. Just as Osiris was cut to pieces by his brother and restored by Isis, so too must the king be symbolically dismantled and renewed. His skin was pricked, his blood drawn, not as punishment but as offering, a message written in flesh to the gods. I suffer so Egypt does not. The body was no longer private, it was the living temple. When priests placed the double crown upon his head, the act was not merely political. It was a declaration that he had died to himself and been reborn as divine. The pain endured in those hours was the bridge between mortality and eternity. Daily life after coronation continued this rhythm of divine affliction. The pharaoh's diet was measured to maintain ritual purity, often denying comfort in favor of spiritual focus. Certain festivals demanded that he stand motionless for hours under the desert sun, wearing heavy regalia that dug into his skin. The public saw only splendor, shimmering gold, intricate headdress, a god among men. Yet behind the ceremonial perfection lay exhaustion, bruises, and the constant ache of discipline. The body of the ruler was a sacrifice in slow motion, each day a renewed offering to sustain divine order. Temples like Karnak and Luxor became laboratories of suffering disguised as sanctuaries. Their towering columns hid inner rooms where priests prepared the king for communion with the divine. Smoke coiled around him, mixing with the scent of resin and blood. Sometimes he was cut lightly on the forearms or legs so that his blood could mix with wine during prayer, a symbolic union between mortal pain and celestial pleasure. The sight of red against gold was not seen as grotesque but as sacred balance, the reminder that life and death coexisted within the same flesh. The priests called it the harmonizing of the body, an act necessary to keep the gods attentive and Egypt's fate secure. But beneath the ritual purpose lurked a quiet psychological toll. To be treated as divine meant to be eternally watched, eternally tested. Any illness, any weakness, any hesitation could be interpreted as divine displeasure. The pharaoh's body carried not only the burden of faith but the paranoia of failure. Every ache, every wound was both a message and a warning. In the solitude of the inner chamber, surrounded by statues of gods with cold stone eyes, he must have wondered whether he was still man or only myth trapped in mortal skin. The gold that adorned him became armor against doubt, but also a cage he could never remove. The priests reinforced this divine bondage through constant ritual reminders. Before any sacred ceremony, the pharaoh had to recite ancient confessions. I have not weakened. I have not turned from the gods. I have not feared pain. These words, carved into temple walls, became chains of devotion. The higher his divinity rose, the more he was required to suffer to sustain it. Even the concept of rest was alien to his role. The gods rested in eternity. The pharaoh had no such right while bound to the living world. His agony was his duty, his devotion, and his proof of worth. Yet, in this cruel symmetry, there was also awe. The Egyptians saw their rulers suffering not with pity, but with reverence. The people believed that when the pharaoh bled, the gods were appeased. When he endured, the Nile would flood, and life would return. To see him sweat and strain was to witness the machinery of creation itself at work. His torment was sacred choreography, a dance between flesh and divinity that kept the stars in motion. The more he suffered, the more eternal Egypt became. Thus, the divine body of the pharaoh stood as both miracle and warning. His majesty was not born from privilege, but from pain sanctified by ritual. His smile in public was not arrogance, it was performance, a mask over endurance. Behind that serene expression lay centuries of inherited agony, a legacy of divine servitude passed from one god-king to the next. Pain was his crown, obedience his throne. To rule Egypt was to offer every heartbeat, every wound, and every breath to the gods who demanded satisfaction, not through mercy, but through the holy art of suffering. Behind the towering walls of Egypt's temples lay a world that few living souls ever saw, a world sealed from sunlight, where smoke, blood, and whispers merged into something halfway between faith and fear. This was the domain of the priesthood, the keepers of divine appetite, the ones who stood between gods and mortals. To the people, these priests were holy servants. To those within the temple, they were engineers of pain. Every ritual, every chant, every motion was part of a sacred machinery designed to feed the gods who never slept. The gods did not eat bread or drink wine like men. They hungered for sensation, devotion, and the trembling of mortal flesh. The priests existed to satisfy that hunger. In the heart of Thebes or Memphis, as the outer courtyards filled with the scent of burning myrrh and the hum of prayers, the inner chambers throbbed with darker energy. The walls were painted with scenes of sacrifice, humans kneeling before gods, knives poised above hearts, blood flowing like offerings of light. The priests moved in silence, their shaved heads glistening with oil, their linen robes stained from ritual purification. They were not executioners but interpreters of divine will. To them, the act of drawing blood was not brutality but a conversation with eternity. Each cut, each burn, each whispered plea was a syllable in the language of the gods. Animal sacrifice was daily routine. Bulls, geese, and goats were prepared, adorned with garlands and blessed before the blade touched their flesh. The priests chanted verses that elevated the act from slaughter to sanctification. The smell of blood was masked with incense, yet never entirely hidden. It lingered, reminding all within the temple that creation and destruction were inseparable. The organs were placed on gold trays, their steam rising in curls that priests read like messages. Sometimes, the pharaoh's own blood would be mixed with that of the animals, symbolizing unity between mortal and divine. In those moments, the temple became a living altar, a fusion of life and death offered to beings unseen. But within these rituals lay a darker possibility, one whispered in foreign accounts and hinted at in forbidden papyri. Some ceremonies, it was said, required not animals but humans, captured enemies, condemned traitors, or even chosen servants who believed that dying for the gods ensured immortality. These were the silent offerings. There are no inscriptions describing them, only gaps, as if the scribes themselves feared to record what they witnessed. The victims were not executed publicly but disappeared into the temple's hidden sanctums, where their pain would become divine music. Their screams were muffled beneath the roaring hymns of priests, their blood absorbed into the sand floors that had seen centuries of such rites. The purpose of these rituals was not cruelty, at least not as the priests saw it. In their theology, the gods required vitality, not death itself but the moment of it, the pure, raw burst of life energy released in agony or ecstasy. The priests sought to harness that instant, to trap it in sound and smoke, sending it upward through the temple shafts toward the heavens. They believed this energy rejuvenated the gods, ensuring the Nile's flood, the fertility of crops, and the endurance of the kingdom. Without pain, the world would stagnate. Without offerings, the gods would grow weak, and chaos would reclaim creation. Thus, every ritual wound, every trembling sacrifice, was a form of cosmic nourishment. Inside the temple of Karnak, where columns soared like petrified trees, priests performed the ceremony of the burning breath. In this rite, symbolic effigies of chaos spirits were scorched in sacred flame while priests chanted names of divine wrath. The pharaoh would sometimes attend, offering his own hand to the fire as gesture of solidarity with the gods' suffering. The smell of charred flesh, whether symbolic or real, merged with perfume and song. The people outside would never know the truth. To them, the smoke rising into the dawn was simply incense, not the echo of something far more primal. Psychologically, these rituals created a paradox. The priests lived in constant contact with death and fear, yet were revered as holy. They washed their bodies obsessively, shaved daily, and wore linen so pure that even dust was forbidden on it. They touched filth, pain, and mortality every day, yet were symbols of divine purity. This duality defined them: clean hands, blood-stained hearts. They spoke of harmony but dealt in agony. For the priests, the temple was not a place of peace, it was a laboratory of balance, where pleasure and pain, life and death, holiness and horror coexisted. Many priests began their service as children, taken from noble families and raised within temple walls. They were taught that emotion was weakness, that compassion for victims would disrupt the sacred balance. Some grew to believe that witnessing pain without flinching was the ultimate proof of faith. Others, however, broke under the weight of their duties, retreating into madness or silence. Ancient writings mention the eyes of Sekhmet, priests said to have gone blind after witnessing too much divine wrath. Whether metaphor or truth, it spoke of the psychological toll exacted by such worship. To feed the gods was to starve the soul. And yet, for all its darkness, the system worked. Egypt endured for millennia, its fields fertile, its sun steady, its rulers divine. The people outside the temples prayed for blessings, never knowing the true price paid behind closed doors. The priests did not seek gratitude, only obedience. They believed their hidden suffering kept the universe alive, that their rituals of pain were the spine of creation. In their minds, the gods were not cruel masters but eternal engines of balance, requiring from humanity what humanity itself could barely comprehend: the offering of fear, the music of agony, the beauty of sacrifice. By the end of this section, the viewer should feel the claustrophobia of the temple, the weight of unseen blood beneath gold and stone. Egypt's holiness was built not only on devotion but on an unspoken contract, that pain, when properly given, could feed the heavens. And within that dim sanctum, as torches flickered and hymns drowned out cries, the priests of Egypt ensured that the gods remained satisfied, not with love, but with suffering transformed into worship. The sun rose like a blade over the Nile, cutting light through clouds of dust and sand. Beneath that burning sky, thousands of men bent their backs toward eternity. The world knows Egypt for its monuments, colossal pyramids, temples, and tombs that pierce the heavens, but few dwell on the price they demanded. The grandeur of stone was paid for in flesh. The pharaoh's glory was written not in ink, but in scars. Every block of limestone, every chisel mark on granite, carried with it a pulse of human agony. Yet in the Egyptian mind, this suffering was not meaningless, it was holy. The laborer's pain was an offering, their exhaustion a hymn to the gods who demanded constant devotion through toil. The construction sites of Egypt were more than workplaces, they were open-air temples. Under the supervision of the royal priests and overseers, labor was structured as ritual. Each day began with purification rites, washing in cold water from the Nile, chanting prayers to Ptah, the god of craftsmen, and drinking a meager ration of beer that both sustained and numbed. The workers were not told they were slaves of the state but servants of divinity. To them, building the pharaoh's tomb or temple was a sacred assignment. The sweat on their brows was seen as the Nile's reflection, proof that their suffering kept the world alive. To falter was not just to disobey authority, but to disappoint the gods themselves. The air near the quarries was thick with stone dust, a constant haze that turned skin to clay and lungs to fire. Men swung hammers until their hands split open, and women carried baskets of gravel until their spines curved. Overseers watched, rods in hand, their whips echoing across the desert like divine commands. But even the blows were justified by faith. The priests preached that pain purified the spirit, that each lash was a reminder that the gods demanded perseverance, not comfort. The Nile's flood came only through balance, toil for grain, blood for blessing, obedience for order. The workers endured, believing that their agony was the mortar of eternity. Some ancient writings describe the songs of labor, rhythmic chants sung by workers to pace their movements. These songs were not laments, but prayers disguised as melody. Lift for the king, lift for the gods. One reconstructed verse reads, "And Ra will see your hands." The repetition was hypnotic, turning backbreaking work into something transcendent. Through the rhythm of sweat and pain, labor became meditation. This was how Egypt endured centuries of toil without revolt, by transforming suffering into spiritual harmony. To them, pain was not injustice. It was purpose. The conditions, however, were merciless. The workers' villages, like those found near the Valley of the Kings, were crowded, hot, and suffused with the stench of blood and limestone. The men slept on straw mats, their bodies covered in bruises and dust. Physicians treated them with honey and moldy bread, both antiseptic and symbolic of the gods' mercy. The priests visited occasionally, not to comfort, but to bless the continuation of suffering. They would sprinkle sacred oil on wounds, proclaiming, "The body endures so the soul may rise." To heal too quickly, they warned, was to interrupt divine rhythm. Despite the brutality, there existed moments of beauty within this chaos. When the sun dipped below the horizon and the workers sat along the riverbanks, the same men who screamed under the whip would laugh, share bread, and tell stories of gods who suffered just as they did. Osiris torn apart, Ra burned by his own creation, Isis mourning in endless grief, these divine agonies mirrored their own. Pain connected mortals to the gods. Endurance made them divine. They did not curse their fate. They saw in their exhaustion a reflection of sacred order, a pattern written into the fabric of existence. But there were darker truths hidden beneath this faith. Not all believed. Some cursed the temples quietly at night, whispering that the gods were gluttons who feasted on their misery. In the quarries, bones were sometimes found carved with hieroglyphs, not prayers but pleas, "Let me see my family again. May my son be spared this task." These forbidden inscriptions were never meant to be read. They were confessions to an uncaring heaven. The overseers destroyed them when found, erasing any trace of rebellion from history's stone pages. To speak against divine suffering was heresy, a crime punished not by man, but by the gods themselves. In the grand ceremonies celebrating the completion of temples or tombs, the pharaoh would appear before the exhausted masses, radiant and divine. The people cheered, tears streaming down faces cracked with dust. For them, seeing the living God walk among them was the culmination of their pain, a sign that the heavens had accepted their offering. The pharaoh would raise his arms, blessing those who had suffered in his name, and the priests would proclaim that the gods were satisfied. In those brief moments, the people felt their torment transfigured into immortality. Their hands had built eternity, and their agony had fed the gods. Yet beneath the divine rhetoric, there was exploitation. The system thrived on devotion, not mercy. The pharaoh's architects understood that faith was the most efficient form of control. The belief that suffering led to salvation kept millions obedient, generation after generation. The pyramids, magnificent as they are, were monuments not only to divine ambition but to the psychology of submission, to a civilization that turned agony into architecture. As the camera of the mind pulls back, we see the contrast, golden monuments gleaming under the eternal sun, and beneath them, invisible veins of human pain stretching through time. Egypt's eternity was not built from stone alone. It was carved from endurance, from the belief that pain, when offered willingly, could sustain the gods' satisfaction forever. The workers' cries faded, their bones became dust, but their suffering remained etched into every pillar and wall. Even now, as the winds howl through the ruins, it carries the same echo, the hymn of those who labored, bled, and believed that through pain, they touched the divine. The temples glowed with golden fire as night descended, their pillars casting vast shadows across the desert. Inside, the air thickened with incense and whispers, and the priests prepared for what they called the rites of purification. These were not acts of cruelty in their eyes, but of devotion, a sacred theater in which pain became prayer. The human body was the bridge between worlds, and pain was the thread that bound it to divinity. In Egypt, pleasure and agony were not opposites but twins, born of the same sacred truth. The gods must be fed not with food, but with feeling. The Egyptians believed that blood and flame carried divine essence. When offered properly, these forces pleased the gods who governed life, fertility, and rebirth. In these rituals, pain became offering, not destruction, but transformation. The priest spoke of releasing life energy, a concept that blended theology and mysticism. Each drop of blood was a spark, a fragment of the sun god Ra's own fire, and to shed it willingly was to contribute to cosmic balance. Through ritual wounds, heat, and exhaustion, mortals mirrored the eternal suffering of gods who died and were reborn daily in the cycle of the sun. One of the most feared and revered ceremonies was dedicated to the lioness goddess Sekhmet, the Eye of Ra, the bringer of plague, and the purifier of sin. Her temples were filled with statues showing her teeth bared, eyes blazing. When the Nile ran red with silt each flood season, the people saw it as her thirst being quenched. The Feast of Sekhmet was no celebration, it was appeasement. Priests would ignite great braziers, their heat so intense it made even stone sweat. Participants fasted for days before entering the sanctum, where they would pierce their skin lightly with ritual blades, offering blood to Sekhmet's image. The pain, the heat, and the smoke combined into a sensory delirium, a controlled chaos meant to echo the goddess's fury and transformation. The climax of the feast was the ritual of drunkenness, where wine mixed with blood was consumed to honor the legend of Sekhmet's pacification. According to myth, when Ra feared that Sekhmet's rage would destroy all humanity, he tricked her by flooding the earth with red beer that she mistook for blood. Drunk on it, she fell asleep, and the world was spared. In reenacting this myth, the Egyptians believed they were maintaining that delicate truce, that by blending pleasure and pain, they reminded the goddess of mercy. The participants would dance, shout, and collapse into exhaustion, blurring the line between ecstasy and agony. In the morning, many bore scratches and burns, but they believed themselves purified, their bodies emptied of sin. Fire was not the only purifier. Water, too, played its role in the sacred pain. The ablution of renewal involved immersion in the Nile before dawn, the water icy and filled with silt. The priests believed that the shock of cold expelled spiritual impurities. The initiate was held under just long enough to lose breath, to flirt with death, before being pulled up gasping, reborn in the eyes of the gods. To endure was to live again. The Egyptians found divinity in thresholds, between breath and suffocation, flame and flesh, agony and bliss. Pain was the portal, and they walked through it willingly. Psychologically, these rituals were engineered to reshape the mind. Pain sharpened attention, burned away doubt, and replaced fear with submission. The participants entered a trance where individual will dissolved into cosmic order. In this state, they believed they could hear the gods. Some claimed to see visions, flashes of Ra's light, or the face of Osiris smiling through shadow. For the priests, these experiences proved the success of the ritual. Suffering had stripped away illusion, leaving only divine presence. The gods, after all, were not gentle. They were forces of nature, creators and destroyers both. To please them required courage, not comfort. Even the architecture of the temples reflected this philosophy. The corridors narrowed as one approached the sanctuary, forcing the body into submission. Ceilings lowered, light dimmed, and air thickened with incense until breathing itself became labor. By the time the supplicant reached the inner shrine, every muscle ached, every breath burned. Only then, broken and trembling, could they stand before the god's statue, the embodiment of power, silent and indifferent. The design itself was a ritual. To reach the divine, one must first endure the weight of suffering. The priests believed that the universe was a mirror, and what happened in the temple reflected the eternal drama in the heavens. Fire symbolized the sun's agony as it died each night. The spilling of blood mirrored the dismemberment of Osiris. The cries of the participants echoed Isis's mourning. In their theology, creation itself was born from pain. The gods had torn themselves apart to make the world, so every act of devotion had to echo that primordial sacrifice. Pain was not an interruption of life, it was its very foundation. But behind the sacred reasoning, another truth flickered like the temple flames. Pain was power. The priests, as custodians of these rituals, controlled who suffered, who was purified, and who was blessed. To endure the ceremonies was to prove loyalty. To refuse was blasphemy. Over centuries, the line between divine necessity and human domination blurred. What began as holy sacrifice became social control. a system where fear of divine wrath kept obedience absolute. The gods' hunger became the priests' authority. As dawn broke over the desert, the smoke of the previous night's rituals drifted into the sky, mingling with the pink light of the sun. The people would rise from their beds, see the haze above the temples, and whisper that the gods were satisfied. They would not know that satisfaction came at a price, that every blessing was purchased through wounds, heat, and exhaustion. Egypt's perfection shone golden in the sunlight, but beneath that brilliance lay the pulse of suffering, rhythmic, eternal, and sanctified. To the ancient Egyptians, pain was not evil. It was proof of life, proof of faith, proof of connection to forces too vast to comprehend. In their minds, to feel agony was to share the language of the gods. Through ritual flesh and fire, they believed they were feeding eternity itself. And as the flames faded and the blood dried, the temples of Egypt stood silent and gleaming, monuments not only to divine glory, but to humanity's endless belief that suffering, when offered to heaven, could make the world endure. The desert was both cradle and executioner. Every dawn, the horizon split open in searing gold, and the people of Egypt faced a world that demanded endurance. Between the furnace of day and the frozen silence of night, the Egyptians saw divine rhythm, creation and destruction locked in eternal balance. To survive here was already to suffer, and so suffering became sacred. They learned to interpret every hardship, every lash of the sun, every blister of the sand as part of a cosmic test. Pain was not merely tolerated, it was sanctified, woven into the very psychology of faith. In this land of extremes, the idea of purification through pain made perfect sense. Egypt's priests taught that the body mirrored the landscape. When the desert burned, the soul must also burn. When the Nile froze under the moon, the spirit must endure cold to remain pure. Thus, fire and ice became symbols of divine cleansing. To the Egyptians, the extremes of nature were the moods of the gods themselves. When the sun scorched crops, it was Ra's warning. When the river flooded, it was Hapi's rage. Rituals of heat and chill were not superstitions. They were conversations with these temperamental deities, acts meant to remind the divine that humans, too, could suffer in devotion. In the temple of Sekhmet at Memphis, fire dominated worship. The rites of flame were conducted in chambers so hot that even stone walls glowed faintly red. Priests wore masks of gold shaped like roaring lions, their breath shallow under the heat. Before them, initiates knelt on black stone, the air rippling with heat waves from braziers filled with burning resin. The ritual required them to hold their hands above the flames until the skin blistered, symbolizing the burning away of impurity. The priests told them, as flesh suffers, the soul becomes clear. To flinch was to fail. Those who endured were said to be reborn in the goddess's sight, purified, transformed, their agony accepted as divine exchange. Water offered its own form of torment. At temples along the Nile, especially during the cold months, initiates underwent the rites of flood, a ceremony of immersion and deprivation. At dawn, they were led into the river, shackled to stones to prevent them from escaping too early. The Nile was icy in the early morning, and the shock of its embrace made hearts pound and lungs convulse. The priests stood on the banks, chanting hymns to Osiris, who had drowned in the primordial waters of the underworld and risen anew. When the initiates were finally pulled from the water, shivering and gasping, the priests declared them awakened. It was not survival alone that mattered. It was endurance, the ability to surrender to the gods' will even when the body cried for mercy. These twin elements, fire and water, became the pillars of Egyptian purification philosophy. Together, they symbolized life's eternal cycle, heat as the fire of creation, water as the coolness of death and rebirth. Many rituals combined the two. After being scorched by flame, initiates were plunged into cold water, their screams swallowed by the steam that rose between them. This contrast, pain followed by relief, agony followed by silence, created a trance-like state that priests believed opened the third gate, a mental threshold between mortal consciousness and divine awareness. What modern psychology might call trauma, the ancients saw as revelation. The connection between pain and purity was not confined to the temples. Even the common people mirrored it in daily life. Farmers whipped themselves lightly during droughts, believing that their pain would remind Ra of human suffering and coax him to release rain. Mothers cut their palms when their children fell ill, offering blood to Hathor for healing. Warriors, before battle, burned small scars into their arms as vows to the gods of victory. Pain became prayer, the one language all could speak, from peasant to pharaoh. Yet, within this sacred endurance, there was manipulation. The priesthood understood that those who suffer are easiest to guide. Rituals of purification also served as rituals of control. To question the need for pain was to question the gods, and that was unthinkable. Over centuries, the theology of suffering hardened into law. To refuse the rites was to risk being labeled impure, a danger to the balance of Ma'at. Some were cast out of villages for avoiding purification. Others vanished after being taken to temples for cleansing, never to return. Pain became both devotion and discipline, a tool for maintaining obedience in a world built on divine hierarchy. For the pharaoh, these rituals carried an additional burden. He was expected not only to endure them but to embody them. During the annual Festival of Renewal, the pharaoh would symbolically die and be reborn through ordeal. His body was exposed to both elements, searing heat and freezing water, as priests invoked the names of Ra and Osiris. The king's suffering was said to mirror the sun's death each night and its rebirth at dawn. To the watching priests, his groans were hymns, his endurance, proof of Egypt's continued survival. The ceremony ended with anointment in oil mixed with ashes and river clay, the union of fire and water, death and life. The pharaoh emerged shining with gold dust, trembling but divine once more. In the psychological heart of these practices lay something profoundly human. Pain made the invisible tangible. When one burned, one knew the gods were real. The body could lie, the tongue could flatter, but agony was pure truth, undeniable, honest, uncorrupted by intellect. The Egyptians believed that through controlled suffering, one could touch eternity, even for a heartbeat. That conviction gave meaning to their hardships, their hunger, their grief. Suffering explained everything: the floods, the famines, the losses, and made existence itself part of a sacred narrative. As the camera of the imagination lingers over Egypt's landscape, fire flickering in temple courtyards, mist rising from the Nile at dawn, the paradox of this civilization becomes clear. Their glory was sustained by pain, but that pain was never senseless. It was ritualized, sanctified, turned into architecture, art, and myth. In their minds, the gods themselves endured endless cycles of burning and drowning to keep the cosmos alive. Humans could do no less. By the end of this chapter, one truth remains: Egypt was not merely a land of light, but of balance, where agony was as divine as beauty. Every scar left by flame, every gasp drawn from icy waters, was part of a sacred dialogue between flesh and eternity. To live here was to serve. To serve was to suffer. And in that suffering, the Egyptians believed, the gods themselves found satisfaction. A quiet, burning peace in the endless rhythm of fire and ice. The tombs of kings shimmered under torchlight, their corridors filled with the scent of oil and embalming resin. Here, within these sanctuaries of stone, Egypt's obsession with the body reached its most exquisite and terrifying form. Death, for the Egyptians, was not an end but a transformation, a crossing from one realm to another. Yet that passage was neither peaceful nor painless. The body had to endure one final ordeal, a sacred mutilation that mirrored the god's own suffering. Every slice, every incision, every ritual act of violation was meant to elevate the dead to immortality. Pain, once more, was not the punishment of life, it was the price of eternity. The mummification process began with silence. The embalmers, chosen from the temple order of Anubis, entered the chamber as if walking into a holy battlefield. Their faces were hidden behind jackal masks, representing the god of death himself. Before them lay the body, no longer a person, but a sacred vessel waiting to be prepared for divine resurrection. The first act was separation, the cutting away of mortal frailty. The brain, thought to harbor chaos and unclean thoughts, was drawn out through the nose using bronze hooks. It was not kept, Wisdom, they believed, lived in the heart, the mind only confused it. The sound of the skull hollowing was both horrific and holy, the first step in turning man into God. Next came the heart, the most important organ of all. In some eras it was left inside, in others, removed and wrapped separately in linen marked with protective spells. The heart was believed to testify before the gods during the weighing of the soul. It could not be destroyed, only purified. The embalmers treated it as sacred flame, untouchable and eternal. Then, the abdomen was opened with an obsidian blade, and the inner organs removed. Each was preserved in jars guarded by the sons of Horus, divine sentinels who protected the fragments of humanity needed for rebirth. The liver, the lungs, the intestines, all became relics of flesh, infused with salt and resin. The act was gruesome, but in Egyptian eyes, it was recreation, the body disassembled as Osiris once was, so that it might be reassembled purified and whole. The process continued for 40 days of desiccation as natron, the divine salt of the desert, drew the fluids from the corpse. The body shrank, hardened, and cracked. The priests watched this transformation as a metaphor of cosmic balance, water leaving flesh, chaos leaving order. To them, decay was not rot, it was alchemy. They anointed the skin with oils made from cedar and lotus, mixing perfume with the faint scent of death. Every gesture was prayer. Every movement of the embalmer's hand echoed the original work of the gods when they restored Osiris after his murder. By reenacting divine pain, they kept the myth alive. The opening of the mouth ceremony followed, one of the most ancient and symbolic rituals in Egyptian religion. The priest touched sacred instruments to the mummy's lips, nose, and eyes, reciting incantations to restore the senses. This was more than a blessing. It was resurrection through pain. The belief was that for the soul to awaken in the afterlife, the body had to feel once more, to suffer one last touch of sensation. Even in death, pain remained the bridge between worlds. The priest's blade, the same instrument that had cut open the body, now became a key, unlocking the mouth to let the spirit breathe eternity. The mummy was then wrapped, not hastily, but layer upon layer, hundreds of linen strips binding body and faith together. Each layer bore spells, each knot sealed with prayers. The wrapping was a second skin, meant to hold the divine essence within. Yet beneath the beauty of the linen and gold lay the truth. The body had been broken to become perfect. The stillness of the corpse was deceptive. Within it, the Egyptians saw motion, the silent journey of a soul through the underworld, guided by the map of its own pain. To the priests, this process was not cruelty but compassion. In their theology, no one could enter eternity untouched by suffering. Just as Ra endured burning each night as he sailed through the underworld, and Osiris was torn apart to be reborn as king of the dead, so too must every mortal endure purification by the blade. Pain was the fire that forged immortality. The embalmer's tools were extensions of the god's hands, and through them, divine perfection was achieved. But the ritual was not without fear. Even those who performed it were haunted by its sacred danger. They wore masks not only to honor Anubis but to protect themselves from spiritual contamination. To cut the dead was to trespass upon divinity, to balance between reverence and sacrilege. Some ancient texts mention embalmers who went blind or mad, said to have seen glimpses of the god's agony reflected in their work. The transformation of flesh into eternity carried a cost for both the dead and the living. The culmination of the ceremony came when the mummy was sealed within the sarcophagus. The lid, carved with the face of the deceased, symbolized rebirth, the merging of human and divine identity. The priests chanted the Litany of Light, a prayer describing the soul's journey through darkness, pursued by serpents, demons, and shadows of doubt. They believed that the preserved body radiated divine energy, that even pain endured in life would serve as protection in death. Each wound, each scar, became proof of worthiness, the evidence of a soul that had known struggle and emerged purified. As the final stone was placed over the tomb, silence fell. The flickering torches reflected off the gold masks and the eyes of statues, witnesses to the eternal exchange between flesh and divinity. Outside, the desert wind howled like a lament, carrying the essence of all who had suffered and ascended before. For the Egyptians, this was not mourning. It was triumph. Through the ritual of sacred death, they believed they had conquered decay, turning human pain into everlasting form. Even now, when we look upon those preserved bodies lying in museums, wrapped and silent after thousands of years, we are seeing more than mummified flesh. We are seeing a civilization's ultimate theology made physical, the belief that agony, when sanctified, becomes beauty, that the gods themselves were born in suffering, and that through pain, the mortal could become eternal. The pharaohs understood this better than anyone. Their tombs were not monuments to peace, but to struggle. Their silence is not rest. It is the echo of sacred pain made immortal. Above the mortal realm of deserts and rivers, in the endless sky of myth, the gods of Egypt bled just as men did. To the Egyptians, divinity was not distant perfection but eternal struggle. Their gods hungered, wept, burned, and were torn apart, and in their torment lay the key to creation itself. The Egyptians did not worship kindness, they worshipped endurance. Their pantheon was a mirror of human agony elevated to cosmic scale, a gallery of immortal beings who found meaning not in peace, but in suffering. To understand why pain was sacred in Egypt, one must first understand the gods who suffered most. Osiris, lord of the afterlife, was the first victim of divine pain, the prototype of all suffering that followed. Betrayed by his brother Seth, murdered, and dismembered into 14 pieces, Osiris's story became the backbone of Egyptian theology. Each temple ritual echoed his agony, each burial reenacted his restoration. Isis, his devoted wife, searched the land for his scattered remains, mourning over each fragment before reassembling his body. Her tears were said to form the flooding Nile, life born from grief. Through her devotion and magic, Osiris was resurrected, but not as he was before. His rebirth came with scars, his body incomplete, his vitality traded for eternity. In this myth, the Egyptians saw truth. Only those who endure suffering can transcend it. Every cry of pain was a hymn, every wound a doorway to divine renewal. Even the sun god Ra, the eternal light, was not spared. Each night, as he sank beneath the horizon, Ra embarked on a journey through the underworld, a realm of serpents, shadow, and torment. There, he faced Apophis, the primordial serpent of chaos, who tried to devour the sun's light and plunge creation into darkness. The nightly battle was brutal and endless, the god's radiant body scorched and pierced by the forces of disorder. When Ra rose again at dawn, his golden light was not triumph but testimony, proof that he had suffered and prevailed. To the Egyptians, sunrise was not gentle renewal, it was victory purchased with divine agony. The morning light itself was the glow of a wounded god, bleeding brilliance across the sky. Pain among the gods was not weakness, it was proof of their power to endure. Hathor, goddess of love and beauty, was once transformed into Sekhmet, the lioness of destruction, to punish mankind's defiance. In her frenzy, she slaughtered thousands until the land ran red with blood. Yet even she, the embodiment of divine rage, fell victim to her own violence. When tricked by Ra into drinking red beer that she thought was blood, Sekhmet became drunk, staggered, and wept, horrified by what she had done. Her tears of remorse birthed new rivers, and her shame restored balance. In this myth, the Egyptians found divine empathy. Even gods sinned, even gods suffered guilt. Pain became not only a bond between human and divine, but the foundation of morality itself. Thoth, the god of wisdom, understood suffering as knowledge. He recorded the wounds of gods and men alike, inscribing them as lessons on the walls of eternity. From him came the doctrine that to know pain was to know truth. He taught that without pain, no soul could comprehend justice, and without loss, no heart could value order. The Egyptians carried this philosophy into their temples, their art, their laws. The cycle of divine suffering, death, despair, renewal, became the moral blueprint of civilization. To resist pain was to resist enlightenment, to endure it was to align with the gods themselves. The myths also revealed a disturbing intimacy between creation and cruelty. In the story of the goddess Nut, the sky, and her husband Geb, the earth, the god Shu forced them apart, an act of divine violence that birthed the world. The space between them became existence itself. The pain of separation gave rise to air, life, and time. Every breath a mortal took was a reminder of that first wound, the eternal ache that held heaven and earth apart. The Egyptians did not hide from this paradox. They worshipped it. The world, they believed, was made from divine pain. To live was to participate in it. Priests and philosophers saw in these myths a cosmic symmetry. The pharaoh's pain on earth mirrored the gods' pain in heaven. The same torment that sustained the divine realm sustained the kingdom. The blood spilled in rituals was a reflection of Ra's nightly wounds. The tears of the priests were Isis's eternal lament. This mirroring gave meaning to suffering, transforming it from personal tragedy into universal necessity. Pain was not chaos, it was the language of order itself. Emotionally, this belief provided both comfort and terror. If even gods suffered, then human agony was not meaningless. Yet it also meant there was no escape from it. The gods themselves were prisoners of their own cycles, condemned to bleed for eternity to keep the world alive. Osiris would forever die and rise. Ra would forever burn and be reborn. The universe demanded their torment as its heartbeat. The Egyptians lived within that pulse, seeing beauty in its cruelty. Temples across Egypt immortalized these divine wounds in art. Carvings of Ra's serpent battles adorned columns, while scenes of Isis weeping over Osiris appeared on tomb walls. Every god's suffering was celebrated, not concealed. The priests taught that to look upon such images was to share in their burden, to feel empathy as worship. The divine was not untouchable perfection, it was pain made sacred, refined into purpose. Through that lens, the pharaoh's ordeals, the workers' labor, even the priests' rituals of blood all became reflections of the same eternal truth. The gods bled so that the world might continue, and humans bled so that the gods might remain awake. Psychologically, this worldview forged resilience. The Egyptians did not fear suffering. They expected it, revered it, and gave it shape. Pain was not a monster lurking in the dark but a god's signature written in every human life. When crops failed or loved ones died, they did not ask, why? They already knew. The gods themselves endured worse. Suffering meant participation in the divine drama, and endurance meant victory. As dusk fell over the desert, and the red sun sank once more behind the horizon, the people of Egypt would pause in reverence. They watched as the sky bled gold and crimson, believing they were witnessing Ra's wounds healing under the gaze of Isis. Night was not simply the absence of light. It was the time when the gods screamed and fought for existence. And when dawn returned, so too did faith, a reminder that pain, though eternal, always birthed new life. By the end of this reflection, one truth glows like the dying sun over the Nile. In ancient Egypt, the gods were not symbols of serenity but of struggle. They bled, wept, and endured just as humanity did. The Egyptians looked upward and saw not perfection, but kinship, a mirror of their own suffering carved into the heavens. Their faith was not in divine mercy, but in divine endurance. And through that faith, they learned that pain was not the enemy of divinity. It was its proof, the fire through which both gods and men became eternal. The wind moves softly across the Nile, carrying with it the ghost of a civilization that once believed pain could speak to the gods. The temples are silent now. The chants have faded, the fires long extinguished. Yet as the sun bleeds its final light over the ruins, something still stirs, an echo of devotion, a memory of screams turned into hymns. The Egyptians are gone, but their theology of suffering endures, woven into the very psychology of humanity. Pain was their prayer, their punishment, their proof of divine order. And in many ways it still is ours. To the ancient Egyptians, pain was never random. It was the pulse of the universe, the evidence that creation was alive. Every scar carried meaning, every sacrifice balanced chaos with order. They did not ask for comfort from their gods, they asked for strength to endure. That endurance became the foundation of their eternity. Pharaohs ruled, bled, and died believing their agony held the cosmos together. Priests burned flesh in temples, convinced that each offering rekindled divine light. Slaves broke their bodies beneath the sun, trusting that their suffering sustained the Nile's flood and the kingdom's glory. Pain was not tragedy, it was purpose. Modern eyes see cruelty. But to them, cruelty was divine intimacy. Pain was the only proof that the gods were paying attention. The Egyptians saw beauty in that paradox, that joy and torment could occupy the same breath, that agony could become art. Their world was painted in contrasts, gold and blood, birth and decay, sunlight and shadow. They believed that to touch eternity, one must embrace both halves of existence. This philosophy, as alien as it seems, still haunts the human spirit. We, too, seek meaning in suffering, pattern in chaos, salvation in struggle. Egypt only named it. The legacy of sacred pain did not end with the closing of its temples. It bled quietly into other civilizations, into rituals, religions, and philosophies that followed. The idea that endurance refines the soul can be found in monastic orders, ascetic traditions, and modern ideologies that glorify hardship. The ancient Egyptians turned pain into transcendence, and millennia later, humanity continues to do the same. The language has changed, but the instinct remains. Soldiers speak of sacrifice as honor. Artists speak of suffering as inspiration. Lovers speak of heartbreak as transformation. The gods of Egypt may have fallen silent, but their theology of endurance still whispers in the corners of our lives. Psychologically, this inheritance runs deep. Pain forces self-awareness. It strips away illusion and demands truth. The Egyptians understood that long before modern minds gave it words. They saw pain as revelation. When flesh burns or heart breaks, the veil between the mortal and the eternal thins. In that instant of clarity, one glimpses the divine, not as comfort but as confrontation. Even today, people chase that confrontation, through endurance, through risk, through ritual. We still climb our own pyramids of pain, hoping to stand a little closer to the gods, or whatever remains of them in our imagination. Yet their legacy carries a warning too. The pharaohs believed that because pain pleased the gods, they were justified in inflicting it. The priests turned suffering into obedience, transforming devotion into control. Pain, when sanctified, becomes a dangerous tool, one that blurs morality. It can elevate or enslave. The Egyptians mastered that balance, and perhaps that is why their civilization lasted so long. They found meaning where others found despair. But the same belief that gave them endurance also imprisoned them in cycles of ritual torment. In worshipping pain, they forgot to question it. That, perhaps, is the true tragedy buried beneath the sands. And yet, there is something undeniably human in their defiance of fragility. The Egyptians refused to accept that pain was chaos. They turned it into order, into beauty, into eternity. Their monuments still rise, not because their gods were merciful, but because their people believed suffering could be shaped into permanence. Every carving, every tomb, every hieroglyph is a fossil of that belief, that agony, properly offered, could defeat death itself. It is why their mummies still lie intact after thousands of years, pain embalmed into immortality. As the camera of imagination drifts through the ruined temples, the hieroglyphs seem to breathe again. In flickering light, one can almost see the silhouettes of priests chanting before the fire, their voices trembling in the heat. The air hums with ghosts, pharaohs crowned in gold, slaves singing to the gods as they die, children pressing their palms against temple walls, whispering prayers of endurance. The sound is not despair but devotion. The same devotion that built eternity from agony. And then silence. Only the desert remains, vast, indifferent, eternal. The gods have been buried by time, but the idea they birthed has not died. Humanity still kneels before invisible forces, still trades pain for meaning, still searches for redemption through endurance. The names have changed. Ra, Osiris, Christ, fate, nation, ambition. The gods may have vanished, but their appetite never did. Pain still rules us, not with whips and fire, but with quieter instruments. Sacrifice, effort, love, grief. Every generation finds new altars, new reasons to believe that suffering leads to something greater. The Egyptians were the first to make that belief divine. They built their heaven on it. And in some unspoken way, we still walk their path. As the last light fades behind the pyramids, the narrator's voice softens. They offered their pain to gods of stone, and in return, they built eternity. We offer ours to gods of meaning, and still we hope for the same reward. The screen fades to black. Only one sentence remains, whispered, ancient, and true. The gods may have vanished, but their hunger endures, and in our pain, we continue to feed them.